I believe that things start with financial rigor. They start with knowing the numbers, understanding what's under the bonnet of the company, and saying what levers drive you forward. Various things like that. I think understanding the finances and what drives finances within agency life and what drives performance within those finances is the place to start.
Welcome to the Agency Profit Podcast, a show dedicated to going deep space on agency operations, which is just as nerdy as it sounds. I'm your host, Marcel. I'm the CEO of Parakeeto, a firm that helps digital and creative agencies measure and improve their profitability. Join me as I interview some of the smartest thought leaders and agency owners in our space and go deep into operations, metrics, and all the other things you need to get right so you can spend less time worrying about operations and more time executing on your vision. What is up, everyone? Welcome back to the Agency Profit Podcast. Today, I'm excited to be joined by Ryan McNamara, who is the operator, the head of operations, I got to get your title right, at Rise at 7, which is an international agency operating mostly in the UK and the US, an ex-international athlete. I just found out he represented England at international competitions in sprint hurdling. So unexpected, fun fact. And I'm really looking forward to this, Ryan, because we interview a lot of people on this show that are coaches, consultants, advisors to agencies, but you're in the weeds operating an agency today, and you've done that for a very long time. And so I think this is a really great opportunity for us to talk about what it means to be in that ops role in 2024 after all the changes that we've been through as an industry, and really kind of tap into your mind as one of the operators that I really respect in this space. So with all of that, thank you for being here on the show today.
No, thank you for having us, Marcel. I mean, your podcast and everything you've done is one of the reasons that I think I've been able to get by over the last couple of years.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. It means a lot. And with that, I want to make sure that everybody understands what it is that you've been doing over the last several years. So just really briefly in your own words, what is your background? How did you get into operations, and what brought you to Rise at 7?
Sure. I think it's probably sensible to start at the beginning. In agency life, I exited uni during that recession of 2008. You get offered various roles to be recruitment consultants and things like that, and it just didn't really fit with who I was as a person. A friend of mine was finishing up his PhD in website effectiveness, and he was like, "Mate, I've got a couple of websites that I could use some help with. Do you want to learn how to code and design?" And I was like, "Yeah, cool. I can do this. I'm 21 and not really knowing what's going on in life. I'll give this a go." 6 months later, we had enough work for us to start a company, and we ran that for 10 years. It was mainly working a lot of sport, Puma, Nike, various athletes, like football clubs, etc., or soccer clubs, etc. Ran that for 10 years. We sort of hit a period where I wanted to grow and he was quite comfortable where we were. So I sold up and moved into a creative role at an agency up north in England. Went through the ranks, went to new business director, and then we had a restructure as our new chairman came on board, and we were looking for someone to do operations, and it was like, "Well, Ryan, maybe this is for you." And I was like, "Okay, cool. What do I have to do?" And it's like, "Don't know, go and figure it out." So I was like, "Cool, right, let's have a go at this."
That's the best description of an operations role I've ever heard. Yeah, I don't know, figure it out.
Yeah. So, but I guess because I'd done new biz, I'd sold stuff, I'd been in the craft, I'd designed, I'd devved, I had been project managing, I'd done the bits and pieces, understood agency finance as much as I did back then based on running my own company. So I sort of had a broad understanding of what was going on. And I'm just a bit nosy, I like asking questions and getting involved. We started with EBIT as the thing that I was sort of tasked on trying to make sure that we hit that. And over the course of a couple of years, just grew into the role, really enjoyed it. Moved near enough a year ago, actually, into the role at Rise. Rise are, like you said at the start, a company that have they're 5 years old, but grown very quickly. We have offices in Sheffield, Manchester, London, and New York. We are a search-first creative agency, so we create demand for the companies we work with through SEO, through social media, through PR, and help facilitate that demand on the other side through technical SEO and making sure people are more discoverable. It's been a bit of a wild ride because we are 5 years old. We're babies in the agency game, but when we've got 60, 70 odd people at that speed, it makes cracks start to appear. So been involved for a year. It's been a lot of fun. We've done a lot of growing up within the agency in terms of what we do, what we present, what we report on, forecast on. It's been a lot of fun.
Amazing. Quite a journey, having run your own firm and then, basically wearing almost every hat. Well, I'm sure you wore almost every hat running your own firm, then wore a whole bunch of different hats at another firm, and then eventually found yourself in the operations seat. It's so funny, your backstory, because I think a lot of people listening to this that are in an ops role or have been in an ops role would share this similar story of like you were given the ops role almost as like a consequence for just knowing a lot of different things and having like it's like you're the person who knows the most. So I guess you're going to be in charge of operations now. So a bit of a blessing and a curse at the same time. So it's incredible. Obviously, Rise at 7 growing very quickly. That sets a really good stage for what we're going to talk about today. I want to start by framing what's changed, right? We were talking a little bit before the show about how like agencies, especially smaller ones, boutique agencies, are really starting to take operations and finance a lot more seriously. I think there's a lot more rigor in the operations role than there's ever been. And the question of course, well, why? Why is that different now than it was, let's say, a decade ago when you were starting, or more than a decade ago now when you were starting your firm? What are some of the things that have shifted since that time that have led this operations, finance, efficiency, people, process, like all of these things that sit at the intersection of operations? Why have those become so much more important in this modern context?
Mm-hmm. One of the things I believe, well, I think there's a lot to it. I think back in the day, there was a lot less competition. And so you had more flex in what you could do and what you could present to the world. And so there was less competition for sales, for everything. And so you didn't have to take it as seriously in reality. I think the last couple of years of huge economic uncertainty across the globe and a lot of agencies going out of business or struggling, they've had to really reset the ways of working and understanding the actual how does their agency work? How can we actually make this go faster with far less people and or far less systems or money that we can help here? And so they start looking around and figuring out, oh well, what's that agency doing? How are they actually making this work? Or tell me more about the finance, or tell me, maybe understand the numbers a bit better, or why is this process or this system going to make us better? And then they start realizing, oh, crap, that's operations. That's the stuff that makes us go quicker. That's the stuff that, binds us all together, but also greases the wheels. And so I think people are taking it more seriously because they can see the impact it has on their business, the bottom line. Ultimately, I see it as a business performance role. So that is in multifaceted. It's finance, it's people, it's the actual output of the craft. It's everything that we can possibly do. How do you make that business perform better?
I'll add to this because I agree completely with your philosophy. And my sense is that there's kind of these two tracks that often get conflated. Track number one is the stuff that we have a recency bias around, which is COVID and how that massively increased onshore rates while also massively increasing remote work and driving that forward. And so basically the globalization of digital services and agency services got accelerated significantly. So there was a time pre-COVID where there was still kind of this thing of like, oh, you're in the UK, you hire an agency in the UK, but like that was going away, but kind of slowly. And then COVID happened and then everyone was like, why do we care where anybody is ever? So that like massively, it took the increase in competition, which was already happening because that's what happens in every market, in every industry over time, is more competition enters, margins decrease. So from my perspective, that's like track number two, which is that was already happening because that's just what happens. Margins get lower over time, every industry. But then we had these accelerating factors, COVID being one, AI seeming like it's going to be the next one. And so all of a sudden people thought, like all of a sudden realized, oh shit, this is a problem because we made 10 years of progress in the maturity of our market in like 3 or 4. So I think this is why it feels much more visceral to people now. And especially recently, we've seen a massive emphasis on this. And at least all the things that you're talking about, people all of a sudden paying much more attention to finance and operations, et cetera, because at a fundamental level, the level of sophistication required to just survive in this industry is higher than it's ever been before. And the thing that I'm going to call my shot on this. I don't know if you'll agree with this, Ryan, or not, but like, this is, to me, the permanent state. This is how it's going to be, and it will only get worse from here. That's my thesis, right? It's like, this is what happens to every market. It's like, look at airlines. There's a reason they make 4% EBIT per year, and that's considered a good outcome. It's like, because it's just a hard industry with a lot of competition, and they've been around for a long time.
Yeah, I've been at multiple events this year, and sometimes we've had a good year, like, and in lots of ways, our product is different to people in the market. We were ahead of the shift in certain ways with social search and various things, and so we've capitalized on that and done quite well. But people are still struggling with that idea that the EBIT is going to be, it was 20% a few years ago. That was considered good, and people are now seeing 12, and that is and that's the general idea across the UK at the moment, especially. And it's difficult, and they're looking for any way to bump that up by 0.5% because it makes a difference.
Yeah. Well, and with all that said, like, I'm still seeing agencies that are doing 30, 40% EBIT. So like, that is still possible. It's just way harder to do than it ever was. A couple of other things that play into this is there was a time, and maybe you remember this, when working in an agency, you just kind of assumed you're going to get paid like shit and you're going to work 100 hours a week. And that's just like how it worked everywhere. It's still like that in the consulting industry, but like agency world, we can't get away with that anymore, like by and large. So that's also another massive factor here, where it's like, you can't pawn the mismanagement of the business off on your team and have them make up for it with their evenings and weekends anymore, because the labor market just doesn't tolerate that, which is, like, I think, a good thing. Ultimately, I say that like it's a bad thing, but it's not. It's a good thing. People should not have these unreasonable work expectations. And as an industry, I think it's time for us to grow up and become a little bit more competitive as employers, as opposed to being this place that people go and suffer for several years and cut their teeth and then eventually just go work for a brand.
Yeah, I think that's very true. The wages have increased at a rate that a lot of people haven't been able to keep up with or actually manage correctly. And it's equalizing out at the moment, which is useful for both sides. But yeah, it's it's a multitude of layers, isn't it? That's really affected them. And also, we think like 2 years ago, when I felt like comfortable to start looking for other people in this role, like, you were really the only person that was talking about operations. And so I decided to start talking about operations. Then you start finding others that get interested. And I think that's part of it. Maybe we're in slightly more of an echo chamber at the moment, Marcel, where me and you are really looking for these people who are talking about it. But at the same time, you see far more roles for operations popping up left, right, and center in different ways.
No, it's absolutely true that, like, in the 6 years that I've been around, especially in the last 3, the number of people doing thought leadership on LinkedIn around operations and specifically finance have massively increased, which I think is a good thing, right? Like,
oh yeah,
I'm an abundance guy, so like, that's great. I'm happy the conversation's happening. I believe that we came in and added enough value early on that this is just kind of a tide that's going to rise all ships. So with that in mind, lots of people listening to the show specifically for that reason, you've got a 3 kind of step framework, or 3 major things that you believe are really important based on your experience having stepped in and been successful in operations across multiple firms. So let's talk about what those 3 things are, because I think they are really fitting to this context that we've set now, where it's like, hey, we're all in this situation. We all know that it's getting harder. What do we need to do? And so you've got a proposition for essentially 3 areas to focus on. So let's talk about first what those 3 areas are, and then we can unpack each of them.
Sure. Yeah. So I think this goes back to the start of my operations journey, and that it was difficult to find information about what this role was. And I think that's part of it why people are talking about it more, because they feel that they didn't have the guidance to begin with as to why they should, where do you go with this? And so, yeah, I believe that things start with financial rigor. they start with knowing the numbers, understanding what's under the bonnet of the company, and saying what levers drive you forward. I know that you have. I love when you talk about utilization being the one of the worst metrics you can possibly track, or whatnot. But various things like that. I think understanding the finances and what drives finances within agency life, and what drives performance within those finances, is the place to start. I then think you have to start looking at people performance or performance culture. So how do you actually instill within the team that you have, from leadership down, the idea that this is what performance or good performance looks like, what's expected within that team, and what can you do to make sure that is driven throughout the business? Now, everyone has a different understanding or idea of what that is, because it's all driven from those people at the top. But then it's how do you instill better PDP processes, appraisal processes, actual systems for people to grow within the team. How do they, most people, well, 95% of people will be comfortable if they can see a clear vision and a clear path through a business from one place to the next step to the next step. And that all has to be driven via, an actual proper people performance framework. The last part of that is, because I think you put those two bits in place, you've got good performance within the craft teams, making sure that you do really cool, good shit, and people are backed by good process and understanding as to, this is my first step, this is my second step, this is my third step, this is how I grow within this company. You understand what numbers you actually drive the business forward, and you can start piecing those bits together, and you wrap that in a nice little operational efficiency bow, where you start saying, well, how do I add this, process and system layer to make us be better, incrementally better over a period of time, at those two things. That's how I like to run operations in Rise.
All right. So 3 pillars being, the finance and the performance, people performance, culture, and really how you develop a system around people to make sure that they're growing and doing the right things and know how they're performing. And then the last piece is the process that wraps all of that and how the business runs together. So let's start at the finance and KPI side. First, let's talk about how that became important to you. What's the backstory in terms of how you discovered the importance of that and really got into it and came out the other end of that journey?
It was literally the first thing I started on when I got the role in operations. It was, right, I disagree with this now, but at the time it was like, operations, you're in charge of EBIT. So, okay, cool. I need to figure this out. I disagree with it now because I understand it a lot more. There's far more that goes into, you delivering your EBIT that I could at the time. But it was my mission to make sure that we delivered the best we possibly could. And so you start looking into that. Well, what is the driver of that? And if we take out like the overheads and all the bits and pieces that make up the business, and you look at the actual performance of a team, it was, well, let's understand the actual levers we have, and what things do we know, what things can we see and know that allow us to do more work quicker, more efficiently. That was really where it started. So it was a tough journey, because you start picking at that thread of actual finances, that you start installing like rev recognition and things like that, and it is a real eye-opener, because you start talking about, well, I can't recognize that revenue this month, why? And you start picking and picking and picking. You're like, well, it's probably because we're not delivering the work that we said we're going to deliver, and that uncovers so many more things. So it's understanding those levers you have at that time to do something with. We have, we talk about utilizations within the team, not with individual members, but it's like we know that if we hit this number and we can be efficient with the work we're doing, we use recovery for our sort of efficiency sort of marker. So that if we're going to do, so we say we're going to do 10 grand's worth of work, we know that a person at 70% utilization is going to go do this. If we can recognize that through revenue recognition and then recovery, we know that we're delivering the work that we should be delivering. I know obviously you have a different marker for it, but that's how we do it at Rise, and it's worked pretty nicely. Because like I said, as soon as you start picking at rev rec and, have you really done that work? Have you really done that work? No? Okay, then we need to, we can't class that as efficient work, and we need to go back to the drawing board.
I want to come back to something you said earlier, which is that you now disagree with the idea that operations should be solely responsible for delivering on EBITDA. So let's talk about that a little bit more. Why is that? Why is that belief shifted? Because I think that we could do a whole episode on just this issue, right? Of like the relationship between operations and everybody else, because that's kind of your job, is to be the go-between and to bring all that stuff together. But yeah, talk about that nuance and why that perspective shifted for you.
It shifted because there's too many things that contribute to it, and ultimately, I'm not doing the work. So if I'm not doing the work or actively involved in the day-to-day of driving that work forward, regardless of the stuff that I do, if the teams don't do it, we can't recognize that revenue, and the EBIT will slip. That's really why. And if you're not involved in that in the day-to-day, I think you can help drive the efficiencies, you can help drive the work being done, but you're not there to actually do it. And so I think that is a wider thing that the team have to contribute into. And so people and teams have to understand what they do that can drive profits, and that's why I don't think it's necessarily our role, but it's our role to uncover, report, forecast, make sure that, obviously finance will have a huge part in this, and they'll probably deal with the forecasting of the finance, etc. But it's our role to make sure that we understand it, see the levers that we can pull, and make sure that we're doing it better.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that position. Obviously, it's like you can't control the new business that comes into the business. You also can't control directly the delivery of that work and how efficiently that happens. You can't control how something gets scoped. I mean, but the trap that I think I've seen a lot of operators fall into, and I'm sure you've had this experience, is this is also true about project managers to some extent, is like you are sitting in the middle of the organization and you rely on all of these different stakeholders in the business to give you inputs and to act on outputs. And so you have a tendency especially when you start in a new role, to end up spending an outsized amount of your time compensating for the weakest parts of the organization, because they get in the way of you doing the thing that you were hired to do, which is to like make sense of all this and shepherd the business towards a better place. And of course, in the short term, that's fine. But it's where that becomes a long-term thing, where you end up stuck there, you end up stepping in and basically doing someone else's job over a long period of time. And then everyone's wondering why things aren't going well. And it's like, well, because you're not actually doing the most important thing that you should be doing, which is the operations role, because you're over here compensating for the Achilles heel of the organization, doing half of someone else's job to make up.
Yeah, I think it's our role to make sure you can surface it and you can help fix it. So like, 100%. That great point when it comes to new business, because you're not going to hit EBIT if the new business is weak. It's just literally impossible, because there's not enough work and revenue to put through that business. Let's say for a hypothetical larger team, so you're always going to start dipping, and so that's not really that can't be put on operations, but it's operations and that team to go in and try and figure out, well, what can we do to fix this? So yeah, I don't think you can put it on operations. It has to be, you have to understand how you break EBIT down, and then you have to obviously attribute that to different parts of the team, and they have to understand their roles within it and what they're accountable for and why it drives certain numbers, because that's the only way you can make it sing.
Yeah. Okay. Before we move on from finance, I want to click into one other thing that you talked about here, which was like, you start pulling on this thread of, revenue recognition, and then that starts to tie into delivery, and then that's a whole can of worms. And of course, it's kind of this Rubik's Cube where, okay, you go over to delivery and then you make some changes to how you're measuring things there. And then you go back to RevRec and you're like, oh shit, well, I guess I have to reevaluate this again now. And so you reevaluate that. And then it's kind of this game of whack-a-mole where, because of how intrinsically linked these things are, it could be pretty overwhelming and laborious to like work towards a thing that feels sound and consistent as an entire system. And the other nuance within that is you then have to try to establish the relationship between you as the operator and the finance department and new business and delivery, and where exactly the lines are and the handoffs are, which in every organization is going to be slightly different. Now, you've had to do that now twice. Do you have any kind of high level thoughts or learnings from having to go through that process of figuring out the framework and then trying to figure out the relationship that you have with those other stakeholders and how you're going to work together to bring all that together?
First off, I think it's worthwhile saying that it's never going to be perfect. There's always going to be something that's broken. And so you can't expect it to ever be finished. So I think it's important to say, because I imagine people going through it the first time, like, why the fuck is this not working now? Why have I got to go over here now to fix something else? It's it's just what happens. The team changes, you grow, you take on more clients, you take on different clients, you lose a client, a person that's really intrinsic to a project leaves, and you come bring someone in, they're not quite as good, or they've got a different skill set. These things all matter when it comes to that sort of, the whole well-being of the whole ecosystem of an agency. So it's always needs to be tweaked. Operations, I think my ego isn't big enough to think that I know everything. Like, I'm quite happy in making the craft team's life better. I get joy out of knowing that, if you can go and do some really cool work, we're going to grow, and the team and the company are going to do well, and you're going to have a great time in your job, because I'm trying to take out as much of the laborious work through good operations and good planning and good systems, that you can do some great work. You're here because you want to do good work. You're not here because you want to just sit on your ass and do nothing. So I think that's important. You have to be good with people, but also stern in what you're actually getting out of this. You have to be an educator the whole time, because you will be a few steps ahead of the team in lots of ways, not in terms of the craft and the good stuff that they're doing, but actually where the business is, and you have to sort of bring them along on that journey. Like, instilling RevRec is difficult, because it's such a change of mindset for the leadership team, because let's say in theory we're running cash now. Say you want a £1 million contract this month. You could put that straight into this month and it looks amazing, but that's not the reality of the actual work. It's not the reality of the day to day. So you have to coach, you have to educate the whole time, and you have to sort of show people why these little things you're trying to do, it might be a slight shift on what they've previously done, but how it impacts and makes their life and their work life better. That's one of, I think, the most important thing I've probably learned from it all.
Do you want some free resources to help you measure and improve your profitability? If you do, then I want to tell you about our agency profitability toolkit, which you can grab absolutely free in the show notes or by heading to parakeeto.com/toolkit. It's packed with training videos, cheat sheets, templates, and all kinds of other great resources to help you start measuring and improving the essential metrics that are going to drive better profitability in your business. And it's helped thousands of other agencies around the world do the same. So I want to encourage you to go and grab a copy of that. And if you'd rather get in the fast lane and just have our team of experts guide you through the process of measuring and improving your profitability, then I want to encourage you to apply for a consultation at parakeeto.com. And with that, I want to thank you again for tuning in. I hope you enjoy the episode, and I'll let you get back to it. I think the thing that I'll just double click on that you mentioned there, because it's something I feel like I can't talk about enough, is going into this with the assumption that it's a process, not an event, and that things are going to change. And I think that this is as important as it relates to your mindset with regards to the change management and the collaboration with people. And, you're always going to kind of be like shifting the roles around, and that's a moving puzzle. But then also in terms of how you design your system, this is a mistake I see people make all the time, where they like build something that only works if nothing changes, or only works if all the data that goes in one end is perfect and clean. And it's like, well, we know that that's not going to happen. Like, we know that things are going to change. We know the PM team is going to decide they want a new tool, or that they're going to set up projects slightly differently, or that the naming convention is different all of a sudden, and that finance is going to change the chart of accounts every year for the rest of forever. And so it's like, if we know that's going to happen, then why are we designing our system in such a way that it breaks every time that happens? And why are we surprised? And why are we not assuming that this is going to happen, and giving ourselves a process to get ahead of those things and make sure that they don't break everything, and they don't mess up all of our data, and they don't rob our ability to compare this year to last year because the structure is completely different. Like, these are things that you can actually avoid if you know how to avoid them. But I think it's the naive assumption that you're somehow going to be able to finally solve this that leads people to feeling perpetually frustrated about this thing that is already hard, true, but it doesn't have to feel that frustrating if your expectations are reasonable.
Yeah, I think the idea is that we're really there. Like I said, it's business performance, and that is for the craft teams, the service level teams. They want to do good work. So how do you make that better? We're not there. Like, they can't really process everything they're doing, but let's process map out the stuff that is going to change fairly rare, no, not necessarily ready, and template out those bits and pieces. For the other stuff, let's put in guardrails so that you understand what we're trying to achieve. And it should be all about outcomes. We want to achieve X, And how we get there might be a bit squiggly because the actual stuff you're doing is creative and it needs input, it needs thinking time, strategy time, and whatnot. But we definitely need to get it within a time frame, and we probably need to get it done by X date. So they're the guardrails. How you get there, it's kind of your creativity that might take you to that point, because it might be that you need to speak to this person or to that person, and you might need 15 minutes for someone else to have a bit of a brainstorm about something, but it needs to be done by a certain period of time, and we can't go over that because if that's the next step of the process. We have to hand over to the client, get it signed off, and all that bit. So certain bits have to be kind of tight in that, because you're trying to you're moving that client along the deliverable sort of timeline. And you can't necessarily, you don't want to drop that because that's all linked to revenue and costs and times, etc. But you want to give them the freedom to do a good job and to not feel restricted in, like, I'm telling you this is how you put together a PR campaign, because I don't know. You guys tell me how we're going to do it, and we'll set out the guardrails and like the simple things that we can put in the process that you're bouncing off to keep you on the straight and narrow.
Yeah, all that is true. And then what's also true is that sometimes, no matter how hard you try, all of those things are going to get fucked.
Yeah.
And so it's like, what happens then, right? It's like you need to know and have a system that doesn't completely implode the second that something like that happens, right? Yeah. Or the change management of it is so unbearable. It's like, oh, great, now we have to update 1,000 task assignments in our resource plan, to like update our forecast. It's like, that's unreasonable. It puts you in a position, you're setting yourself up for failure.
Yeah, a lot of the time, what we're doing by doing that is reducing risk, the risk of this chance of this thing happening. And so I talk a lot internally within the teams and sometimes on LinkedIn about this, that yes, we are concerned with risk within operations because we're trying to reduce it, because we also want to give us the opportunity to take these calculated risks going forward, because stuff happens and we want to reduce how many times, like you said, this will get fucked. If you can reduce that down, things are going to be a bit smoother. So sometimes stuff happens that you can't account for. People have stuff that happens in their lives. It screws up project timelines. But as much you can reduce that, the better you're going to do.
I want to get to the other parts of this, but there's these fun rabbit holes to go down. So on that idea, this is an interesting one, because I just had this conversation today with somebody on my team, right, on risk. And it's like, well, risk is interesting because, of course, reducing risk is good, but it's not the only objective. And sometimes I see this a lot with project managers. We're so focused on reducing risk that it actually comes at the cost of the outcome we're trying to get in the first place, right? So it's like the difference between, oh, let's create a templated automated email that goes out to customers that they learn to ignore and not read because it's clearly automated and, templatized, versus writing an email manually, but that is actually much more relevant and is much more likely to convey the information to the client. It's like, well, one option is less risky than the other, but one is much more likely to get us the outcome. And so that's the balance. And the way I think about this is like, let's remove unnecessary risk so we can use a reasonable amount of risk for things that are much likely to get us a reward, right? Because that's always the trade-off. And there's always going to be a tension in the business of trying to reduce risk so we can repeat things that we have to do well all the time, and then take risks in places where we have an opportunity to unlock another level of efficiency, profitability, growth, revenue, whatever for the business.
Yeah, it's 100%, because there's certain things you can do internally at Rise. We'll report in the same way, so data gets inputted in the same way, which means it's very not easy, but it's a templated out process, because you want to spit out an outcome and show certain things that happened. But at the same time, the PR team will always talk about protecting the PR hook, protecting the thing that is actually going to make this, this project, this PR campaign, the special thing that we think it's going to be. And it does take a bit of character. It takes a bit of, confidence in the idea, but we don't want to really template out that, because otherwise it's just kind of boring. And, apparently there's far less humor in advertising now since COVID, when it's probably because people are being safer with ideas because they have to be data led and they have to be backed by stuff. But that is a reduction of risk within the agency game, which has led to less humor, because they know if they do X, Y, Z, it's going to work. However, the things that really stick in people's minds now, things like Liquid Death, agency, brand work like that, is getting so much plaudits and so much exposure because they've taken a risk. They've exposed something that people in the market aren't looking at, and it's paying off. And that's what a well-run business allows you to do.
So on that note, this kind of leads perfectly into performance management. So assuming we get the finance out of the way and that's dialed, we have a good amount of clarity on that. We're able to communicate to the team how we're doing, how they're accountable to that, et cetera. How do we then translate that into a people management process that helps stimulate growth?
Yeah. So I think again, it starts at the top. It's every company will have their own idea as to what performance culture looks like, or the idea of performance within a business. Um, and so that could be, you know, some people see it as a driven idea that people might want to stay behind and do a bit of extra work, and that's deemed performance. Others, it's do you base that on creativity? Do you base that on longevity of people at the company? Do you base that on the awards you've got, or the bank balance you've got? It's very different things. But what I think you can do in all of these scenarios is the vast majority of the people that work for you, what they really want is a bit of security in the job they've got. They want to see growth and progression in that company they're going to get, and they want to believe in the stuff that they're doing, the business and the people that they're working with. So if you can take away, again, maybe a bit of risk, but a bit of uncertainty there, so people can see their route through the company, and if the steps they have to take to get to that next level. That's a big way of growing people within in the business, allowing them to have the freedom to have a bit of a breather, that they're not really too worried about the next steps. But it's also, how do you encourage, how do you back the good things that happen and why they're good things? How do you reward the stuff that actually is performance culture within your company? How do you, call people out for it? How do you hold people accountable for the work that they're doing? Various things like that. So at the moment, one of the big things we're doing at Rise is um, huge organizational and project racy, to allow us to really simply see the steps that every person has within the business, what they're accountable for, and what that actually ladders up to in the wider business context, so that people can see, well, if I do this, I know that that has a direct link to the business doing that, or for me to do that. It makes things a lot clearer and easier. People can see, well, if I do a couple of these things, that probably means I'm going to get a promotion in my next sort of appraisal, because I'm doing the level up as to where I should be.
So let's talk a little bit about, at a very basic level, what does that look like tactically to install a performance management system? What kind of cadences or conversations are you installing in order to start to go from like zero to some minimum effective dose of having this kind of culture?
Yeah. Communication is a big part, as in, like you say, it's what meetings should you be having, or what communication methods should you be having? Is that how does the PDP process work, and what does that actually matter when it comes to like the appraisals? One of the things that when I joined Rise, the old HR team had built out a really nice PDP and appraisal process. So thankfully, I didn't have to do too much with it, but install the idea that this is important for us, because there was a notion that it changed quite frequently. There was no sort of certainty as to, if we do this PDP, is it actually going to matter in the long term? So why should I do anything about it? So we redefined the appraisal process. I'm not taking huge amounts of credit for all of it. It was just me taking what people had done, because I thought it was good, and just making sure it got done and held people, managers, accountable for it. But also, people could see their PDP mattered within that. They were scored on it. It mattered to if they were going to get promotion and a pay rise and all those bits and pieces. So they were encouraged and to do that, but also encouraged to build out various different um, tasks for themselves that actually made a difference to themselves and the business, which obviously accelerated their progression, accelerates the business progression. So I think that's a starting point. What's the cadence in which people are going to get appraised on their work? How can you actually encourage them to actually take an interest in that appraisal and take an interest in their own progression, their growth within the company? Because PDPs are theirs. They should be the one actively working towards it and showing that they've done something. And if you can prove to them that actually we're going to take this seriously, they're going to do something about it. So we just sent out our first round of asked for some feedback, and obviously it's not all perfect, but people are feeling more comfortable that actually the appraisal process, the PDP process, the one-on-one process is allowing them to get better feedback on what they're doing. And also they feel more comfortable and encouraged that actually we're taking it seriously.
So what I'm drawing from this is two main elements, which is regular one-on-ones with managers, and then what you're describing as PDP and appraisal, which, in America we would translate to, development plans. I think that's what PDP would stand for, and then appraisals would be essentially your quarterly performance reviews or your regular
Yeah,
performance
exactly.
reviews. Yeah.
Exactly. And we processized that bit out as well. So it was a standardized scoring system. So people knew, like, if with 360 feedback and manager feedback and all those bits and pieces, it wasn't sort of that if they just got a bad review from their manager that they were necessarily going to get bad appraisal, because actually the team members might be really valued certain parts of their workload, and the PDP process or the personal development plan process might have been, they might have aced everything, they got a green light on everything they did, and that made a huge impact. But there just might be something that's not quite right with something that's working with their manager. So it's not all hinged on one thing. It's a nice, fair scoring system.
That's fascinating. One of the tensions that I'd love to just double click on here that I think is very common for small firms is you kind of have these two tracks. They're often conflated as one thing, but it's difficult to manage when you're small, which is you could have somebody that is absolutely crushing it on development and hitting all the milestones that they would need to hit for promotion. But then the company is not in a position where that role exists or is required or is going to be created anytime soon, which is like part of why, when I speak to some CEOs, they tell me their reason for growing is purely to just try to keep the best talent at the company at this point. Like, they don't personally benefit financially from it a whole lot in a way that impacts their life, but they're like, if I don't keep growing, then all my best talent's going to leave because they have no choice. So how do you think about managing that? I know Rise is growing very fast and you're much bigger than a lot of other firms, and so it's probably less of a problem, but I'd imagine at the upper levels of the company, it's still a consideration in some respects.
Yeah, I mean, Rise, we had to have a churn problem at one point in the past where people left for various reasons, and people obviously still leave every single company. Um, but what we tried to do is reduce the churn for sort of cultural fit or progression as much as we possibly can. But the progression should be on kind of the business's terms, because it's the business that is going to be paying for, you know, that's the growth in reality, and that might not fit with everyone else's growth plans, and that's okay. We've had people leave because they want to focus on more traditional PR methods, or people leave because they want to make sure that their SEO is working with paid, but that's just not quite where we are. You have to be comfortable with that, but you have to have the idea that you can continue to grow good people within it, and that comes through good training plans. It comes through good PDP and appraisal processes, that you feel comfortable in the knowledge that yes, you can grow people to fit the business that is at right now, and that you are unfortunately going to shed some people in that process because it's just not quite a right fit. If you are solely growing just to satisfy the team members' sort of need to grow, then they're not necessarily the right people for you at that right time.
Hmm. Yes, a sobering reality for folks that maybe have had the luxury of having good team members around for a long time. But yeah, there does come a point in time.
It's such a worry, isn't it? Though? I remember the first time you lose someone who's a big player in that team. How are people going to react? How are people going to, in that company? The reality is life goes on, and the reality is that there's an opportunity for someone else in that team to step up and take on other responsibilities. And it might just be the right thing for the business. You can't keep everyone, but you have to make sure that you can progress people at the rates that are comfortable for the business, not necessarily always for the individual. It's the way it is.
So I know we're kind of getting to time here, Ryan, but we've talked about the financial aspect of this. We've talked about the performance management. The last piece here is wrapping this up in process. What can you speak to? What are the essentials of that last idea?
Yeah, I think process is always the thing I come to last in reality, because I think I'm of the opinion that how can you process IS out stuff that you don't really know about? So how can you process IS out, revenue recognition, all the financial aspects, and report on stuff if you don't really know, what you're trying to report on? So I always come to it last, because it's the stuff that is, I think, I don't know how a lot of people in operations would feel about it. I think it's the least important thing. So that's why it's at the end. But it's a thing that continually has to evolve and change and update within the company. So I think guide rails are more appropriate than necessarily always having a fixed process. I think you look to template out things that doesn't change very often. So that might necessarily, like, contract processes for new starters and for clients, and making sure you have all that written out and there's a nice, easy, automated flow. So when someone joins, you know exactly the steps that you need to do to make sure that person has the correct onboarding process, or that company coming in has the correct onboarding process that you're going to set them up for success. Adding them into your project management and agency management systems effectively in the same way, so people understand what they're getting. It reduces time, it reduces stress, and things like that. But so you can template out those things which are fairly rigid. Everything else should probably have a set of guidelines and rules around it. And that does depend on what you're actually delivering at that time, because it's difficult to, with an agency life, that you could template something out when it comes to developing a website, and it works in one instance and it's not going to work in the next 10, because that agency need or that company need is completely different, every single time. And so what you're really looking for is the outcome that thing is going to deliver. So you build guidelines or guardrails around the outcome. So you're guiding people towards that, making sure that they're outcome accountable rather than process accountable, is my opinion.
Yeah. It's like the big idea of standards versus processes. And we've made the mistake of trying to create process when things were just too early, and then it just gets in the way. It actually slows you down. And so I think that is one of the skills of a great operator, is in this way, but in all kinds of other places, having the presence of mind, the experience, the nuanced thinking to know how to balance those trade-offs of leaving something a little bit more undefined and accepting the risks that come with that, and knowing when to time starting to tighten up process and make those investments, because you've kind of tipped over that point of, we know it works, we know it's mature, and we know it's unlikely to change dramatically in the near future. So it's actually going to be a net benefit to create process around this.
Exactly. I mean, if you start adding KPIs to certain things, it kind of focuses people a bit, which can help. And then you can start obviously adding the guardrails either side to make sure that they're focusing on the right stuff. But I think that's one of the reasons why ops get a bit of a bad name sometimes, because we try and wrap things in process right at the start and then get frustrated that people aren't sticking to process, and it just slows things down. You're like, oh, why have you not done X, Y, and Z? It's like, well, because I didn't have to. I could just skip that and do this, and we got the same outcome. That's really what you're looking for. You're there to deliver outcomes. You're not there to deliver process.
So I know we're here longer than I asked you to be here, so I appreciate you sticking longer. I hope you're not late for a meeting. But with all of that, I'm sure there's some people that want to follow you, connect with you. Where should we send them in the show notes so they can learn more about you, Ryan?
LinkedIn, give me a follow. Obviously, set Ryan McNamara or Ryan FMC is like my handle at the end of my LinkedIn URL.
It'll be in the show notes, folks. So just scroll on down. We'll have a link to it there. Ryan, I really appreciate you making time to come on the show. I enjoyed our conversation, and I look forward to hanging out with you the next time I'm in London.
Cool. See you soon.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you've ever found yourself thinking, man, I get so much value from this podcast, I wish there was something I could do to return the favor. Well, today's your lucky day, because you can leave us a review wherever you're listening to this, and it is incredibly helpful. Of course, if you haven't grabbed a free copy of the Agency Profit Toolkit, go and get that. It's got tons of free resources to help you improve your profitability. If you're looking to get in the fast lane and get help from experts to improve your profitability and measure your most important metrics, then apply for a consultation at Parakeeto.com. We'd love to chat with you and figure out how we can help. With all of that, thank you so much for being a listener, and we will see you on the next episode.